She was 19 and had been legally erased from the only home she had ever known. She was left with no family, no prospects, and $75 in a worn leather purse. And with a portion of that money, she bought a flat-bottomed skiff and rowed out into the middle of the Lost Creek Reservoir, a man-made lake that had drowned a town called Harmony. But what nobody knew, what her own family had forgotten in their haste to profit from the valley's demise, was that sealed inside the bell tower of the half-submerged stone church was a truth that would not drown. Stay close and listen to the story of what she found. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Emma Prescott learned the world through her grandfather's hands. Elias Prescott was a man made of pine resin, oiled leather, and quiet patience, while her father, Thomas, saw the family ranch in terms of acreage and cattle prices. Elias saw it in the language of watercourses, survey lines, and the grain of wood. He had been the one to teach Emma how to read a map not as a flat piece of paper, but as a story of the land itself, its rises and falls, its hidden springs and sheltered hollows. He taught her the difference between a saddle notch and a dovetail joint, how to brace a leaning fence post so it would stand for another 50 years, and how to listen to the silence of the high Wyoming prairie and hear what it was saying. Her father saw this as idle time, a foolish indulgence of an old man and a girl who should have been a boy. He wanted a son to inherit the Prescott name and the sprawling lands he'd consolidated. And instead, he had Emma, who preferred a compass to a needle, and the company of her grandfather to any social gathering. The compass was Elias's most treasured possession, and now it was hers. It was a brass surveyor's compass, heavy in the palm, its needle floating on a jeweled pivot, its lid engraved with a simple, steadying phrase, Orientum versus, towards the dawn. He had given it to her a week before the pneumonia took him, his hand trembling as he pressed it into hers. "A person can lose their bearings, Emmy," he'd whispered, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Land changes, people change, but true north is always there. You just have to find it." After his death, the warmth of the ranch seemed to die with him. Her mother had passed years before, a gentle woman lost to fever, and her father had remarried a woman from Cheyenne whose interests lay in new dresses and social standing, not in the legacy of a dusty cattle operation or the quiet girl who haunted its edges. Emma became a ghost in her own home, a reminder of a past her father was eager to pave over with progress and profit. The progress came in the form of the Wyoming Reclamation and Power Company. They came with contracts and engineers, promising electricity and irrigation to the wider territory. The price was the Lost Creek Valley, a fertile basin watered by a river that would be dammed and drowned. The town of Harmony, with its general store, its blacksmith, its post office, and its small stone church, was condemned. Families were bought out, some willingly, others with a bitterness that soured the air for miles. Thomas Prescott saw only opportunity. The company paid well for grazing rights on the new reservoir's edge, and he sold them a tract of land that had belonged to Emma's mother's family, a piece of ground that was meant to be her dowry, her one piece of independence. He saw it as tidying up a loose end, converting a useless sentiment into hard currency. For Emma, it was the final erasure. Elias had surveyed that land with her, teaching her its corners and its character. It was the last piece of the world that felt like it belonged to her, and her father sold it without a word to her. The ejection, when it came, was as quiet and cold as a winter morning. It was not a shouting match or a dramatic scene of tears and pleading. Emma did not plead. She had learned from her grandfather that some forces, like a blizzard or a father's hardened heart, could not be argued with. She was summoned to his office, a room that smelled of aging paper and cigar smoke. Thomas Prescott sat behind his wide oak desk, a ledger open before him. He did not look at her as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the neat columns of figures. "Emma," he said, his voice flat and administrative. "I have finalized the sale of the Miller tract. The company's payment has cleared." He gestured to a small stack of bills on the corner of the desk. "This is $75. It is a fair portion, more than generous, for your relocation. Your stepmother and I feel it is time you made your own way. There is a stagecoach for Lander that leaves in the morning." He finally looked up, his gaze clear and untroubled by emotion. "It is a practical matter. A signature on a deed, a transfer of funds, the closing of a ledger. Her life, her history, her connection to that land, all reduced to a line item." She simply nodded, took the money, and turned away. She packed a single canvas bag with a change of clothes, a block of soap, her grandfather's sharpening stone, and a small, well-oiled handsaw. She slid the brass compass into her pocket, its familiar weight a small, solid anchor in a world that had come loose from its moorings. She did not say goodbye. There was no one left to say goodbye to. The journey away from the Prescott Ranch was a slow unwinding of memory. Every rise in the road, every familiar bend in the creek, was a place she had explored with Elias. The wagon she'd paid a small fee to ride on creaked under a sky the color of faded denim, the dust from the road coating her face and clothes in a fine, gritty powder. She did not look back. To look back was to invite a grief she could not afford to feel. She was focused on the horizon, on the distant, hazy line of mountains that framed the Lost Creek Valley. When the wagon finally reached the turnoff for Lander, she dismounted, shouldered her bag, and began to walk. She walked for miles, following the new dirt road the company had cut along the rim of the rising reservoir. The air grew heavier, damp with the smell of submerged earth and decaying vegetation. And then she saw it. The valley she had known, a place of green pastures and waving cottonwoods, was gone. In its place was a vast, still sheet of water, unnaturally blue and silent. It was a landscape of profound and unsettling emptiness, a world drowned and remade. The water reflected the sky with a perfect, glassy indifference. Here and there, the skeletal tops of dead trees broke the surface, their branches like desperate, pleading hands. A fence line marched straight into the water and disappeared. The peak of a barn roof rose like the back of a great drowned beast, and farther out, almost a mile from shore, stood the church, St. Jude's, the Church of Lost Causes, built of local granite by the town's founders, its stone walls solid enough to defy the water that now lapped halfway up its arched windows. Its slate roof was intact, and above it, the square bell tower pointed a finger of defiance at the empty sky. It was the only thing left standing with any dignity. She made her camp that night on the shore, a small fire of sagebrush warding off the chill. She ate a piece of dry bread and watched the stars emerge, their reflections scattered across the dark water. The church was a silhouette against the fading light. In her mind, she heard her grandfather's voice, telling her the story of its bell, a gift from a congregation back east, hauled across the plains by ox cart. He had said the founders sealed the town charter and the original deeds inside the bell tower's cornerstone for safekeeping. A cornerstone that was now deep underwater. But what if they had moved them? What if, in the last days, knowing the flood was coming, They had sought a higher place. The bell tower. High and dry. It was a foolish, desperate thought. A straw for a drowning girl to grasp at. But it was the only thought she had. The next morning, she walked the 10 miles to the rough settlement that had sprung up to service the dam workers. It was a place of tents, rough-sawn shacks, and mud. She found a man selling off equipment from a defunct freighting business. Among the dusty harnesses and cracked wagon wheels was a small, heavy skiff. It was made of pine, its seams sealed with pitch, and it was ugly and functional and perfect. $20, the man said, spitting tobacco juice near her feet. She counted out the bills without haggling. She also bought a new coil of rope and a short, sturdy pry bar. She spent the rest of the day hauling the boat to the water's edge, her muscles burning with the effort. As the sun began to set, she slid the skiff into the cold, clear water of the reservoir, placed her bag and tools inside, and began to row. The oars felt good in her hands. The familiar ache in her shoulders, a welcome distraction. She was rowing towards the last standing piece of harmony, towards a wild and improbable hope. The water was colder than it looked. Each dip of the oars sent a shiver through the wooden boat, a vibration that seemed to come from the drowned world beneath her. The silence was immense, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the oarlocks and the gentle splash of the blades. As she drew closer to the church, the scale of it grew, its stone walls stained with a dark, algae-green waterline that marked the new reality. It rose from the lake like a weathered monument, a testament to a life that was now nothing but a memory held in the valley's cold embrace. The main doors were submerged, the water still and black in the arched entryway. The lower windows were dark, vacant eyes staring out into the flood. Her goal was the bell tower, the one part of the structure that remained entirely above the water. A small, high window on its north face offered the only possible point of entry. Mooring the skiff was the first challenge. There was nothing to tie to but the church itself. She rowed around to the lee side, out of the slight breeze, and found one of the decorative stone buttresses that supported the main wall. With careful effort, she managed to loop her rope around a protrusion of carved stone, the rough granite scraping against the fibers. The boat bumped gently against the wall, the sound echoing in the unnatural quiet. Now came the ascent. The window was a good 15 feet above the waterline. The stones of the church were square-cut and well-fitted, but a century of wind and weather had etched away at the mortar, creating shallow holds for her fingers and the toes of her sturdy boots. She tested each one before putting her full weight on it, her body pressed flat against the cold, damp granite. The work was slow and methodical. Her grandfather had taught her how to climb the windmill tower for repairs, to trust her own strength, and to never look down. She focused only on the next hold, the texture of the stone under her fingertips, the solid purchase of her boot soles. A small community of cliff swallows had made their nests under the eaves of the tower, and they swirled around her, their chirping calls the only sound of life. Finally, her fingers closed over the rough stone of the windowsill. With a final, lung-burning effort, she pulled herself up and through the narrow opening, tumbling onto the dusty floor inside. She lay there for a moment, her heart pounding, the smell of dry rot, ancient timber, and pigeon droppings filling her lungs. She had made it. She was inside the bell tower of St. Jude's. The space was cramped and dark, lit only by the gray light from the window she'd come through and the slatted openings of the belfry higher up. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light. Above her, the great bronze bell hung motionless in its massive oak frame, a silent tongue in a silent mouth. The floor was thick with dust and feathers. Pigeons cooed and rustled in the rafters, their eyes like small, bright beads in the gloom. The room was empty, save for a pile of old ropes and a broken ladder in one corner. For a moment, a cold wave of despair washed over her. Had she come all this way for nothing? Was this just another dead end? Another testament to a world that was gone forever? She refused to accept it. She ran her hands along the stone walls, feeling for any loose block, any sign of a hidden cavity. Nothing. She stamped on the thick floorboards, listening for a hollow sound. Only the solid thud of old, heavy wood. Her eyes adjusted further to the dimness, and she saw it. Tucked away in the darkest corner, partially hidden by the broken ladder, was a large tin trunk. It was not ornate. It was a plain, functional thing, made of galvanized tin and bound with two thick straps of iron. A heavy, rust-pitted padlock secured the hasp. It was far too heavy to have been carried up here by one person. Several people had placed it here, deliberately. Hope, fierce and sharp, surged through her. This was it. This had to be it. She dragged the trunk into the center of the room, the metal bottom scraping loudly across the floorboards and startling the pigeons into a flurry of motion. The padlock was a solid mass of rust, the keyhole completely sealed. There would be no picking it. She took out her pry bar. She wedged its flattened tip into the small gap between the hasp and the lid, right beside the lock. She put her weight into it, her muscles straining. The metal groaned in protest, but it did not give. She repositioned the bar, finding a better angle, and tried again. This was not about brute force, but leverage. Elias had taught her that. Find the weak point, Emmy. Everything has one. She found it where the iron staple of the hasp was riveted to the lid. She worked the pry bar in, slowly, patiently, worrying the metal back and forth. A rivet popped with a sharp crack that echoed in the small space. Then another. With a final wrenching pull, the hasp tore free from the lid with a shriek of tortured metal. The lock, still attached to the broken piece, fell to the floor with a heavy thud. She paused, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands raw. Then, with a reverence that surprised her, she lifted the heavy tin lid. The air that rose to meet her was cool and dry, smelling of old paper, dried wax, and a faint floral scent like pressed lavender. It was the smell of a carefully preserved past. The contents were packed with meticulous care. On top lay a layer of folded linen, yellowed with age but clean. Tucked within the folds were several heavy, cloth-wrapped bundles. She unwrapped the first one. It was a set of silver communion chalices, tarnished to a deep, cloudy gray, but unmistakably valuable. The second held silver plates, and the third, a heavy silver cross from the altar. This was the church's material wealth, saved from the flood. It was enough money to start a new life, to buy a small piece of land somewhere far away from Wyoming. But Emma was not looking for an escape. She was looking for a foundation. She carefully set the silver aside and looked deeper into the trunk. Beneath the linen was what she had truly come for. There were 3 thick, leather-bound ledgers, their covers stamped in faded gold leaf. Township of Harmony, Records of Deed, Township of Harmony, Survey Maps, and Parish of St. Jude, births, marriages, deaths. Her fingers trembled as she touched them. This was the town's official memory, its legal existence saved from the water. And resting on top of the ledgers was a single, thick envelope of heavy paper, sealed with a dollop of dark red wax. Her name was not on it, but she knew it was for her. It was addressed in a steady, elegant hand. to the one who finds this. She broke the seal. Inside were several folded pages, the paper crisp and dry. She began to read the letter, and the quiet voice of a man she had never met spoke to her across the years. June 4th, 1898, to the one who finds this. My name is Michael Abernathy, and for 42 years I have been the pastor of St. Jude's Church in the town of Harmony. I am writing this on the eve of our town's dissolution. Tomorrow, the final evacuation order takes effect, and the waters will begin to rise. They have promised us compensation, but money is a poor substitute for a home, for a community, for the ground where our children were born and our parents are buried. I am an old man now, and my health is failing. I will not be making the journey to the new lands. I will see my wife, Sarah, soon enough. But I cannot depart this world, leaving a great injustice to stand unanswered. The Wyoming Reclamation and Power Company has acquired this valley through means that are, to be generous, legally dubious. They presented our town council with maps that showed their claim extending over the entirety of our township. But their survey is new, and ours is old. The documents in this chest prove it. You will find the original royal charter for the Harmony Township, granted in 1856. You will find the corresponding survey maps, drawn by Elias Prescott the Elder, and the deed records for every parcel of land granted therein. Pay close attention to the northern boundary. The company's claim stops at the high water mark of the future reservoir. Our charter, however, grants the township an additional 500 acres of high pasture grazing land on the north rim, land that will not be flooded. The company has claimed this land as part of their blanket purchase, but they have no legal deed to it. They are counting on the flood to wash away the proof. I do not have the strength left to fight them in their courts. The other townsfolk are scattered, broken in spirit. But the truth, like our Lord, is patient. I have sealed it here in the highest, driest place I know, with the church's silver to provide a practical means for whoever finds this. I do not know who you will be or when you will come. I only pray that you are a person of good character and steady heart, someone who understands that the land does not belong to those with the most power, but to those with the truest claim. Use these documents. Reclaim what is ours. Rebuild a piece of what has been lost. I have lived my life here. I christened the children and buried the dead. This valley is in my bones. I entrust its memory and its last remaining truth to you and to God's good providence. Yours in faith, Reverend Michael Abernathy. Emma read the letter twice, her fingers tracing the old pastor's steady script. Elias Prescott the Elder, her great-grandfather, the man who had first surveyed this land, whose skills had been passed down to his son, and then to her. This was not just a stranger's legacy. It was woven into the fabric of her own bloodline. The compass in her pocket suddenly felt heavier, a direct link to the man who had first drawn the lines on the map now resting in her lap. The injustice Reverend Abernathy wrote of was not abstract. It was the same cold, administrative theft that her own father had perpetrated against her. The company, her father, they were the same kind of men who saw land as a figure in a ledger, who believed that a signature on a piece of paper could erase a history, a home, a birthright. A quiet, steady anger began to burn in her chest, a clean, hot flame that burned away the last of her despair. She was no longer a cast-out girl with $75. She was the keeper of a truth, the inheritor of a duty. She carefully folded the letter, placed it and the ledgers into her canvas bag, and began the slow, careful work of lowering her precious cargo, and then herself, down the wall of the church and into the waiting skiff. The journey to Lander was fueled by a purpose so clear and bright, it left no room for doubt or fatigue. She sold one of the smaller silver plates in the dam workers' settlement for enough money to buy a reliable horse and a pack saddle, a transaction that drew curious stares but no questions. She rode west, the precious ledgers wrapped in oilcloth and secured carefully behind her. Lander was the county seat, a proper town with a courthouse, a land office, and a grid of dusty streets. It felt like a different world from the raw settlement by the reservoir. She found the land office in a small brick building on the main square. The man behind the counter was old, with a fringe of white hair and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. A small sign on his desk identified him as Silas Croft, county registrar. He looked at her over his glasses, his expression one of weary patience. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his voice dry as dust. Emma did not waste words. She unshouldered her bag, carefully unwrapped the largest ledger, the survey maps, and unrolled the first page on his counter. It was the master map of the Harmony Township, dated 1856, the lines drawn in her great-grandfather's precise, steady hand, the paper yellowed but perfectly preserved. Silas Croft fell silent. He leaned forward, his eyes tracing the old, familiar lines. He ran a finger over the cartouche bearing the name Elias Prescott, Surveyor. "I'll be," he breathed, the weariness gone from his face, replaced by a spark of professional excitement. "I thought all the Harmony records were lost in the flood. The company filed a blanket claim of abandonment." Emma then laid the original charter on the counter, its heavy paper and official seals speaking with an authority that needed no advocate. "Reverend Abernathy preserved them," she said simply. "He wrote that the township's charter includes 500 acres of high pasture on the north rim, above the floodline." Croft adjusted his spectacles and bent over the map, comparing it to a larger county map hanging on the wall behind him. He traced the lines with a gnarled finger, muttering to himself. Yes, here it is. The North Pasture. The company's own survey map, the one they filed, is ambiguous about this section. They've been using it for equipment storage, but their title... He trailed off, then looked at Emma, his eyes sharp and appraising. "Their title is defective. The original charter predates the company's existence by 40 years. This land was never legally theirs to claim." He straightened up, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Miss?" "Prescott," Emma said. "Emma Prescott." Silas Croft's smile widened. "Well, Miss Prescott, it seems you have the truest claim in this county. Let's get the paperwork started." The rebuilding began not with a hammer and nails, but with ink and paper. With Silas Croft's guidance, Emma filed a formal petition to the Territorial Land Court, challenging the Wyoming Reclamation and Power Company's title to the 500 acres of the North Pasture. Her claim was based on the original charter and deeds she had recovered. The company, a faceless entity in Cheyenne, responded with a team of lawyers who dismissed her claim as frivolous, the fantasy of a young girl with a box of moldy papers. But the papers were not moldy. They were clear, legal, and validated by the county registrar. The court set a date for a hearing in 3 months' time and stipulated that for her claim to be considered in good faith, she must demonstrate intent to inhabit and improve the land. She had to build a home. She used the money from another piece of the church silver to purchase a plot in town, a small lot with a shed where she could store her things. But she would not live in town. Her home would be on her land. She bought lumber, nails, glass for a window, and a small cast-iron stove. She loaded it all onto a hired wagon and made the 2-day journey back to the north rim of the reservoir, to the rolling expanse of high grassland that was legally, if not yet officially, hers. The community began to form around her not through words, but through work. The first to appear was Jedediah Stone, the Lander blacksmith. He was a mountain of a man with a quiet demeanor who had seen her in the land office with Silas Croft. He rode out to her campsite one evening on a sturdy mule. He didn't say much. He just looked at the small cabin she was beginning to frame, the logs notched with a skill that surprised him. He picked up her grandfather's axe, tested its edge with his thumb, and grunted. "Edge is rolled. Saw needs setting." The next day, he returned with her tools, sharpened to a razor's edge, the steel clean and bright. He refused any payment. "A good tool wants to do good work," was all he said, before turning his mule and riding off. A week later, Eleanor Vance, the widow who ran the town's boarding house, arrived in a buckboard. She had heard the story from Silas Croft. She brought a basket with a whole roasted chicken, a loaf of fresh bread, and a jar of apple butter. She saw Emma, tired and covered in sawdust, and her maternal heart went out to her. "A body can't build a house on jerky and hardtack," she said, her voice full of practical kindness. She stayed for an hour, asking nothing, simply offering the quiet company of another woman. The last to arrive was a young man named Ben Carter, an apprentice surveyor working with the county. He was fascinated by the old maps and came out on a Sunday, his day off, with his transit and chain. "Mr. Croft said you might need help finding your corners," he said, a little shyly. Together, they spent the day walking the land, using her great-grandfather's map and Ben's modern equipment to drive stakes that marked the true and legal boundaries of her claim. Jedediah, Eleanor, Ben. They were the first citizens of this new, reclaimed piece of harmony. By the time the first snows began to dust the high peaks, the cabin was finished. It was small, just a single room, but it was solid. The log walls were chinked tight with mud and moss. The roof was sound, and the small stove drew perfectly, filling the space with a steady, radiating warmth. From her doorway, she had a clear view of the reservoir, a vast expanse of blue and silver, and rising from its center, the resolute stone tower of St. Jude's. She had become a part of the landscape. The people in Lander no longer saw her as a stranger. They knew her story. They called her Emma Prescott, the woman who was reclaiming the North Pasture. Her name had weight. Her presence had meaning. Small rituals began to define her days. She would rise at dawn, her first glance always to the church. She would work on her land, clearing brush, planting a garden for the spring. In the evenings, she would read from the old Harmony ledgers, learning the names and stories of the people who had lived in the valley below. She was not just occupying the land, she was tending to its memory. The unwanted pasture, overlooked by a powerful company, had become her refuge, her livelihood, her proof of existence. It was not a grand ranch house, but it was a home, built not just of wood and stone, but of purpose and the quiet respect of a newfound community. It was warm, functional, and entirely her own. One clear, cold afternoon, as the winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-dusted ground, Emma stood in the open doorway of her cabin. The air was still, and the only sound was the faint whisper of the wind through the pines. She held her grandfather's compass in one hand, its brass case warm against her palm. On the simple wooden mantelpiece above her stove sat a single silver chalice from the church, its tarnished surface reflecting the flickering firelight. Two objects, one from a man who had taught her how to find her way, the other from a man who had trusted she would. Elias and the Reverend Abernathy, two strangers to each other, bound together by their faith in true lines and lasting truths. She thought of the letter her father had given her, not a letter, but a dismissal, a cold accounting that had declared her value at $75. And she thought of the Reverend's letter, written to a nameless stranger, a warm and hopeful entrustment of a legacy. Her father had tried to erase her from the map of his life, but her great-grandfather had drawn a map that had, in the end, led her home. The people who had cast her out saw only what was gone, but she, with the help of those who had been forgotten, had found value in what remained. The high pasture was no longer an anonymous piece of corporate property. It was her land, her home. She could feel the solid floorboards she had laid and planed herself beneath her feet. The cabin smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and the faint, lingering scent of Eleanor Vance's apple butter. This small, sturdy shelter was the physical proof of her right to exist. A right she had secured not by begging or by fighting, but by patient work and the careful presentation of a truth that had refused to be drowned. The men in Cheyenne in their fine suits had underestimated the strength of old paper and the resolve of a 19-year-old girl with nothing left to lose. They had looked at a flooded valley and seen a closed chapter. She looked at it and saw a beginning. Emma Prescott was 19 when her father sold her birthright for a signature in a ledger. He gave her $75 and his back. With 20 of those dollars, she bought a boat, and with the rest, she bought the time to row into a dead valley and find a truth sealed in a bell tower. It was the best $75 she ever spent. We all have places, people, or parts of ourselves that have been overlooked or dismissed as worthless. The world is full of abandoned churches and flooded valleys, holding truths that others were in too much of a hurry to see. What is the unclaimed pasture in your own life that might be waiting for you, if only you had the right map to find it? Thank you for being with us tonight. Share this story with someone who believes in second chances, and we'll see you again next time.